Harvard College Learning Challenges Association, and we're hosting a forum inspired by this class entitled Learning Disabilities, Learning Challenges, and Positive Psychology. A lot of students on campus are registered with learning disabilities, and even more have learning challenges, which can include a difficulty studying or chronic procrastination. Also, a lot of learning disabilities are associated with higher rates of depression and low self-esteem. So in this forum, we hope to ask questions like, how can we think positively about learning disabilities, and how can we use positive psychology to further explore this field of study? All are welcome, whether you have a learning challenge, or your friend does, or you just have a tough time studying, or you're just interested. Please come and join us. It's conveniently timed 1 week from now, Tuesday, 11:30, in the Adams House Conservatory, which is between the entrance and the dining hall of Adams House. So mark your calendars. It should be a good discussion. We hope to see you there. Thank you so much.
My name's Holly, and I'm the president of an organization on campus called the Leadership Institute at Harvard College. And Dave and I wanted to just quickly mention what the club does. One of our founders actually is one of your TFs. John Duchin over here helped get the group started a few years back. So very briefly, the club has 4 main programs, all aimed at promoting leadership on campus. We have a development program where we bring in speakers to work on workshops and interactive seminars to help all of us on really useful skills like running a meeting and negotiation and public speaking. They're all free and open to all undergraduates. We also enable collaboration between student presidents, chief editors, captains on campus through luncheons and discussion forums. We have an outreach program where we train Harvard undergraduates as instructors for a leadership curriculum, and we run a 1-year program on Saturdays with middle school students here in Cambridge. And lastly, we're starting a student leadership-focused magazine that will be distributed in the future.
Hey guys, my name is Dave Zivaldi. I'm the Leadership Development Initiative Director at the Leadership Institute. I'm here to give you a little bit of an idea of what's in store for the fall. First of all, we have the President's Forum, which is a banquet that brings together students from all across student leaders from all across the campus to discuss their own experiences with leadership and the challenges related to that. Afterwards, we had our very first magazine coming out, which is pretty exciting. It'll have a lot of articles about leaders that we've hosted at past events and their own experiences with leadership. We have a lot of other events following that, as Holly had mentioned before, with negotiations and a lot of public speaking events in store. If you'd like to know more, you can just Google Leadership Institute at Harvard College, and you should be able to find our website. Thank you for your time, and I hope to see you at some of our events next year.
So we had a breakfast this morning with the teaching staff of this class. It was our final breakfast get-together, and I'm a little bit sad. So hopefully I'll be happier by the end of the class. Today we'll finish up on self-esteem, and the next time is the last time we meet, for this semester at least, and I'll summarize what we have done, where we have been, and all the places that we will go. Just a recap on what we did, which is on the slide now. There's been a lot of research, a lot of talk of how important self-esteem is. And it is important. There's research suggesting that it's connected to our well-being, to our success, that it's inversely related to crime, substance abuse, unhappiness, anxiety, depression. So self-esteem is important, we know that. However, not all was well in self-esteem land, as we discussed last time. Part of the problem is that there are contradictory evidence. On the one hand, self-esteem is associated with benevolence and generosity and empathy. On the other hand, high self-esteem has been shown to be associated with hostility, lack of cooperation, defensiveness. There's also misunderstandings about how self-esteem affects performance, how it affects happiness, and where that comes from, the paradox of self-esteem. Sometimes we feel like we're doing so well, we're getting so many accolades, our self-esteem increases, only to go back to its base level, only worse, because now we have to do even more to come back to our base level of self-esteem. Have to get more accolades, more achievements. Nothing is enough anymore. So there are these contradictory evidence of where self-esteem comes from and its consequences. And one of the ways to explain it is by drawing on the work of people like Maslow, people like Nathaniel Branden, people like Carl Rogers, Rollo May, Lovinger, to see how we can perhaps break down self-esteem into its components. And that's what my dissertation did. And this is what I presented to you in the previous class. Basically take the ideas of these select few researchers who had been thinking about it, people like Bob Keegan across the road from the Ed School, thinking about self-esteem more developmentally. And I presented the epigenetic model. Epigenetic, once again, meaning that one level has to be fulfilled, or at least partly fulfilled, before we can go to the next level. And the three levels are dependent self-esteem, independent self-esteem, and unconditional self-esteem. Dependent self-esteem, the two components of it, first of all, a person with high dependence needs the accolades of others, constantly chooses whether it's a career path or what to do this afternoon based on how much approval that will gain him or her. Person with dependent self-esteem, when it comes to competence, always compares him or herself to others. Am I better or am I worse? Superior or inferior? Independent self-esteem is self-esteem that's contingent on the self. In terms of how I evaluate myself, it's my internal voice that's speaking. In terms of how my levels of competence are determined, it depends on how much I've improved, how much better I've got, how much I feel that I have fulfilled my potential. That's independent self-esteem, not contingent on what other people say or think. Unconditional self-esteem is the highest level. The level that Maslow would talk about is self-actualization. What David Schnarch talks about as differentiated, or at the level of being known rather than desiring to be validated. Unconditional self-esteem is when our self-esteem is high enough, we feel good enough about ourselves not to be concerned with evaluation of others or even with self-evaluations. In terms of comparison, we don't compare. We're interdependent, connected to others. So the example that I gave last time is of a book. Let's say I publish a book and I have high dependent self-esteem. First of all, I write it, I publish it so that I can get accolades. My primary motivation is external approval. My primary motivation is wanting to bring out a book that will be better than the other books out there. So relative competence as well as externally other determined. If I bring a book or write a book and I have high independent self-esteem, I write it and I evaluate it myself. This is good work, or this is not so good, needs improvement. In terms of comparison, I compare it to myself. I've improved a lot since I started writing. This book is actually better than my previous book. My work is becoming more authentic, more real. That's independent self-esteem evaluation. Unconditional self-esteem, the highest level that we know of, I write a book, and I'm not concerned about evaluation of whether it's good or bad. Of course, I want it to be better and better, but that doesn't affect how I feel about myself. I simply exist. I write the book. I'm in a state of flow, experiencing the experience. In terms of whether it's better than others or better than I've written, it doesn't matter. What I'm happy about, what makes me happy, is bringing a good book into existence. And I would be as happy if someone else wrote the book. I'd be as happy or happier if someone else wrote a better book that can help others more. The important thing to understand about this model, the three levels, is that we all have all three basically from a very young age. It's not that the Dalai Lama or Mother Teresa or Nelson Mandela or Margaret Mead, the people whom we know are self-actualized. It's not that they don't care about what other people say. However, they're most of their lives, most of the time, self-determined. Do what they believe in. Feel a sense of connection to others. Want to make the world a better place. But it's not that they don't care. It's not that they don't evaluate themselves relative to themselves or relative to others. That's part of human nature. My error when I started with this research was that I said to myself, okay, I just want to have independence. And later when I understood what unconditional self-esteem was, I said, I want to have unconditional self-esteem. And I situated those two on the good side and dependent self-esteem, bad. And what then happened, it only intensified my dependency on others. Because when we fight nature, nature fights back and we can't win. You know, it's like going back to the second class. If I say to myself, Tal, don't be nervous, don't be nervous, don't be anxious, what happens? The pink elephants begin to come out. And I become even more anxious and more nervous. Whereas where I accept it as part of my nature, let it be, permission to be human, it loses a lot of its vitality and force and control. Because then I can say, okay, yes, I care that this person didn't like my book, didn't like my class, and I accept it, it's natural, it hurts me, I would much rather that they all like it. But then I can move on and say, okay, what would be the most authentic life that I can lead? How can I be the teacher who is known as opposed to constantly concerned about validation? Active acceptance revisited. Accepting my nature and then deciding what would be the most appropriate action to take. One of my role models is Warren Bennis. Warren Bennis has done a lot of research and a lot of speaking and a lot of work in the area of leadership. He teaches out at University of Southern California, was before that at Harvard, at MIT, and he came to Harvard Business School for 3 years. And the first year as a visiting professor. The first year I took his class, which was an extraordinary experience. The second year, when he taught it, I was his teaching assistant. And I used to work a lot with him and interact with him, and was constantly amazed by Warren. Warren, at the time, was 80 years old. Now he's 83. Would walk into the room, and the room would light up. It was his smile, his posture, his openness, his expressiveness was there about, he was interacting with people and making the other person, just by being there, feel better about themselves. And yet he was confident and strong, and what I would classify as self-actualized, as a person with very high unconditional self-esteem. And we became very close, and he helped me in many areas, most of all by just being himself, me observing him, learning from him, assimilating what he had to give the world and what he was giving day in and day out to thousands and millions of people who have read his books, who have been to his lectures, who have had the privilege of interacting with him. And one day, after a couple of years that I was his TA and we were close, I said to him, Warren, how is it that you're like this? How is it that you're like this? And his response was, put his hand on my shoulder, looked at me with his calm, accepting, giving smile, and said, Tal, I wasn't always like this. And that's where he left it. And this is what I needed to hear. Because in his response were two very important, many more, but two very important messages. The first message is that it evolves. It takes time. You don't become third-level, self-actualized individual overnight at the age of 20 or even at the age of 40. It takes time. It takes work. It takes self-awareness. It takes falling down and getting up, learning to fail, and then learning from that failure. It takes learning to accept oneself. It takes being open and being vulnerable and making mistakes. It takes being human, fully human. I was not always like this. The second message that I got from this is that Warren was genuine. He was real. He didn't say to me, oh, Tal, stop. Oh, not really. Come on. Thank you. But no. He was real. He knows his worth. He's confident. There was no false modesty involved, and it reminded me that when I started thinking about self-esteem and the true meaning of self-esteem, as you read in Brandon's work. By the way, he and Nathaniel Brandon are good friends. When I started reading Brandon and I realized what real self-esteem was about, I realized that people with high levels of self-esteem are modest. They don't have the need to show off. You know, arrogance, narcissism is the exact opposite of self-esteem. Hubris, foolish pride is the exact opposite of what a true sense of self is. So when I understood that, one of my most important goals was to become, more importantly, to be modest. And it was incredibly important for me that everyone knows how modest I was. You know, Francis Bacon, the British philosopher, said that modesty is but another form of ostentation. And for me, that certainly was the case. It's not always the case. I think Warren Bennett is modest and truly modest. I think Nelson Mandela, when he's being modest, he really is modest. But the question is, how do you get to that level of modesty? And you get to this level of modesty by being authentic, by being real, by going through the process. And the process, in many ways, as I've described last time, is like learning how to walk. Initially, when we're born, we have no idea what walking even is. Then, later on, we're able to get up, but we need the support either of another person or something to lean on. And we take our first precarious steps around the desk, for example. And then after a while, we can walk without help, but we're still thinking about every step. And we fall down and we get up again, learn to fail or fail to learn. And then we continue walking. We're very conscious of how we pick up this leg. And when you watch a baby learn how to walk, it's fascinating. So many things have to come together for this simple, seemingly simple action. And then after a while, the baby becomes more confident and she begins to run. And she no longer has to think about walking or running, because then she simply walks. Same with a sense of self. Initially, we have no sense of self. There's no differentiation between the me and the mom or other objects in the world. Gradually, we develop a sense of self, but that sense of self is completely dependent. Physically as well as psychologically, we're dependent on our parents. significant adult, older sibling. And then after a while, that usually happens when we're teenagers, we begin to assert our independence. That's when we begin to want to hear our own voice, want to make our own voice heard. That's the difficult teenage years. Difficult for the teenager, difficult for the parent. But it's natural. It's part of evolution. And we need our boundaries at that time, and at the same time we need to sometimes break boundaries. We need to test reality, assert ourselves. And then over time, when we do that, over time, we begin a new process simultaneously. And that is the process of real differentiation, where the independent self becomes so strong that we're able to connect to others as well. Once again, going back to relationship, Nathaniel Branden, the more independent we become, the more interdependent we can be. And then we evolve, and that takes a long time. And if we have missed out on the dependent side, for example, if we didn't get any accolades and any praise and unconditional self-regard, in the words of Carl Rogers, when we were younger, then we have that need. Remember, the model is epigenetic. We can't jump over a stage. And then very often it would take a therapist to provide us with unconditional self-regard so that we can go to the next level. Or we need a relationship or relationships where we cultivate unconditional self-regard so that we can go to the next stage. And if we were, when we were teenagers, constantly told to be quiet, to behave, prevented from asserting ourselves, being ourselves, then we're unlikely to get to the next level in a smooth way. And then very often later on in life, we need to do that first, to assert ourselves, like teenagers did or do, so that we can make it to the next level. But regardless, this is not a smooth transition. Why? Because there are no perfect parents. Because there is no perfect environment. There are no perfect teachers. And for us to evolve naturally and smoothly through these stages, it's just unrealistic. It doesn't exist, not here on Earth. But then when we evolve over time, through the hardships, through the difficulties, making mistakes, falling, getting up again, gradually the interdependent self, the unconditional self-esteem emerges, and we feel much more comfortable in our skin. Maslow said that he didn't find people below the age of 45 who were self-actualized. And even though self-actualized people still have remnants of independent as well as dependent self-esteem, it never really goes away. But it's only weaker now. It's not dominant. It's not what they are about. The next accolade, the next praise. Being devastated when someone doesn't like them. Being devastated when they're not the best. They accept it. They say, oh, it would have been nice to win this. And then they move on and they ask, how can I make the world a better place? How can I be a conduit for positive emotions? Maslow didn't find anyone below the age of 45. Schnarch talks about how it's in the 50s and 60s that the individuals become differentiated, and that's where the highest potential for passion is within a relationship. It takes time. I was not always this way. It was not always like this, as Ben has pointed out. Very important lesson. Many people ask about the universal nature of this theory because, independence is very much or individualism is very much a Western construct, or American, Western European construct. You go to Africa, very different. The concept of we, of a group, is much more central to who they are. You go to Asia, the concept of the we, collectivism, the group, is much more central to who they are. So what about other areas? Is this a Western-centric theory? And the answer is not necessarily. You see, if our goal is to become fully actualized, or to strive toward that, to be in the process of becoming a person, in the words of Rogers, then that final stage of interdependence is the same in all cultures. All cultures value it, and they value it just the same. The process may look different for a person in Japan than for a person in the United States, for a person in Israel or Egypt compared to a person living in Zimbabwe. The process may look different. However, it will have many similarities. Remember, I talked about the Dalai Lama in the third class or so, who said that one of the problems that he sees in Western psychology is that we focus too much on cultural differences. And again, Dalai Lama is extremely sensitive culturally. But he says there are differences, we need to study them. At the same time, we need to study even more so the similarities, that which brings us together, that unites us. And there are a lot of similarities. And hopefully soon there will be more and more research on this topic, applying it to different cultures and tweaking it and seeing how it relates outside the Western tradition. Because most of the research that I'll mention in a minute has been done in the United States, some of it in the UK. It'll be interesting to see what that process looks like elsewhere. But at its core, it is much more similar than different. Why is it important to be independent? Why is it that we should strive for this evolution? Shouldn't we stay at the conformity dependence level? And I will argue, and research shows, as well as historical incidences show, that it is important to cultivate independence as a way to cultivating interdependence. First of all, because of moral behavior. If you think about it, the worst atrocities throughout history were conducted by people conforming, by obedience to authority, and by racist or ethnocentric beliefs and behaviors. Now look at these three things obedience to authority. A person with high dependent self-esteem is much more likely to be obedient to an authority figure. Why? Because he or she seeks accolades, they seek approval, they don't feel strong enough themselves, they need that very charismatic leader to tell them, oh, you're fine, you're okay, you're superior. Because that's what their sense of self is dependent on. Because we're much more likely to conform to what a group is doing if we need constantly the accolades of that group. You think about the Milgram experiments, you think about Asch experiments, those of you who've taken Psych 15 or Psych 1. You think about racism. What is racism? Racism is about comparison and wanting to assert superiority on the basis of some external factor. In other words, I'm not good enough as I am. In order to prove how good I am, I have to compare myself to another. And whether I choose place of residence, whether I choose upbringing, whether I choose the color of the skin. It's about relative competence. Whereas people who are independent don't have the need, or have less of that need for comparison, as well as less of that need to conform. They're true to principles, their own principles. Now, this is not a panacea. This is not always good, because I'm sure there were also Nazis who were true to their principles. But as I'll show later in research, those who are true to their principles are more likely to follow their heart And unless their heart is damaged, and I mean that in the true sense of the word damaged, they will seek to do good. They will seek to help. Their levels of empathy will increase. And this is the paradox of empathy. It's actually when we cultivate empathy, or rather when we cultivate, for lack of a better term, and I don't actually want to use a new term, when we cultivate self-love, when we cultivate self-esteem, that's when we're most likely to be empathic and to love others. Look at the golden rule. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. What is the prerequisite of loving your neighbor? The self. You're the standard. We are the standard of how we evaluate others, because our behavior toward others very often, not always, but very often mirrors our behavior toward ourselves. So people who cultivate an independent sense of self, who have a strong self-identity, are better able to identify with others. In addition to moral behavior, better cognitive performance. You see, people who have a strong dependent self-esteem, or primarily driven by what other people say, will follow the road that has already been taken. They can potentially be great mechanics because they'll work hard for these accolades, and that's a good thing to work hard. But they'll basically remain within the box. Whereas people who have a stronger sense of independent self-esteem think outside the box. Choose the path that hasn't already been taken. That doesn't mean that they can't walk in the path that has been taken if that is what they really, really want to do with their lives. So, it's just as much a sign of dependence when we say, well, I'm going to do the opposite of what everyone else does, because I'm still dependent on what everyone else does. So that's not independent self-esteem. That's just more dependence. But if I sit down and I say, okay, what do I really, really want to do with my life? And I think about it, truly, put myself in a world where no one would know what I was doing, I'm much more likely to identify that thing which is my passion, my core, my calling, be it in investment banking or working at Unilu. It doesn't matter. The question is, what is the source of that? A person with independent self-esteem is committed to continuous learning. Remember the John Cotter study. What differentiated the HBS grads, the extraordinary ones, from the rest, was that they were always asking questions. They always wanted to learn more. They didn't get out of, graduate from college or graduate from business school or from a PhD program or wherever it is and say, okay, I know enough. All right, now I'm a manager, now I'm a leader. I'll tell people how they should. This is the amazing thing about Warren Bennis. He's always asking questions. He's always interested in what people are doing. He's always learning. Happiness, levels of happiness are higher, and I'll show you the research in a minute, when we experience a sense of independent self-esteem. We're much calmer when we don't constantly have to prove ourselves to others. It is enervating to constantly be on the guard. Is this person going to like me? How do I gain their validation? We're much calmer when we say, let me express myself, and yes, it may hurt me. It will hurt me if they don't like me. But that's okay. I'm resilient, I'm strong, I can deal. Much calmer sense of being when we express rather than constantly try to impress. Imagine how much lighter our lives can be if when we're here or when we walk out of here, we experience this sense of being more and more of the time. Again, not perfectly, because that's not human, but more and more of the time, to just be, to exist, to celebrate our existence and existence as a whole. Let me share with you some of the research. There hasn't been a lot, and I want to share with you just some of the work that I did for as part of my PhD and a little bit beyond. The first research that really was able to deal with the paradox of self-esteem, of how some people get so much accolade and yet their self-esteem decreases, or how some people who have high self-esteem are hostile versus others are generous and benevolent. The first research that was done was by Kernis, who back in 1995 came up with the concept of self-esteem stability. And he said what actually can predict whether a person will be hostile or generous, whether their self-esteem over time will be high or whether it will lower over time, is not self-esteem per se, but rather it's the stability of their self-esteem. And what he showed, and he followed people, for example, for a week or 2 weeks, and he would measure their state rather than trait, their state self-esteem at the time. So there were certain people who, if this is self-esteem level and this is time, there were people whose self-esteem at this point was here, and then the next day here, and then here, and then here again, and then here, and here, and here. And he measured it, let's say, 10 times. And what he wanted to see was to measure the standard deviation of this spread. How close was it? How stable was it? So this would be someone with maybe on average high self-esteem, but with a lot of fluctuations. Other people were more like this. Again, ups and downs, but sometimes large fluctuations, but overall pretty stable. Same level of self-esteem, trait self-esteem, but state self-esteem fluctuated far less. And what he showed was that it was the stability rather than self-esteem per se that determined whether or not the person would be hostile or benevolent. People with unstable self-esteem were more likely to be hostile. People with more stable self-esteem were more likely to be generous and benevolent. Resolving a lot of the contradictions, misunderstanding in the literature. When I saw this, I had a personal eureka experience, and I said, this is it. He's onto something. And what I did in my master's thesis back in 2000 was create a questionnaire, a very simple questionnaire that measured dependent versus independent self-esteem. And I measured students, it was mostly Harvard students. I did it also cross-sectional in Singapore. I was spending a lot of time there at the time. Similar results, Asia and here, at least in Singapore and in the United States. And what I found was that dependent self-esteem was associated with instability. Independent self-esteem was associated with stability. In other words, I came up with one measure that instead of measuring 10 times whether that kind of self-esteem will lead to hostility or anxiety versus calmness or generosity, I used just one measure. And that's what I found, very high correlation between dependent self-esteem and self-esteem instability, positive correlation, and a positive correlation between independent self-esteem and self-esteem stability. Then some of my students at the time did research on it. For example, Melissa Cristino, who you'll meet, at least some of her writing later on in this class, did her senior thesis as an undergrad here on showing the connection between independent self-esteem and happiness, and independent self-esteem and flow. Those who had high independent self-esteem were most likely to experience flow on the athletic field, which is where her research was, Harvard Athletics. Also connected to higher levels of happiness. Then my dissertation was trying to pin down these exact characteristics that were problematic in the self-esteem literature. Remember, high self-esteem means narcissism. How do you differentiate? Well, what I found in the dissertation was that narcissism is connected actually to high dependent self-esteem. There was no correlation between independent self-esteem and narcissism. When it comes to generosity, this was probably the most surprising result of the study, people with independent self-esteem were actually more generous and benevolent, both in terms of self-report and in terms of their actual behavior toward other people. A strong sense of self. Remember, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Do not try and do others what you would not have done unto yourself. And when you have a high standard for the self, there's a high standard for the other. And that usually happens automatically because we mirror our behavior toward the I. And then hostility. No correlation between hostility and self-esteem per se, because some people with high self-esteem have high levels of hostility. Some people with high self-esteem have low levels of hostility and more generosity. But dependent and independent self-esteem predicted hostility. Those with high self-esteem that was mostly dependent were more likely, not always, not every person, but on average were more likely to display hostility. Those people with high self-esteem that is mostly independent were much more open, cooperative, and generous. Perfectionism. Two of my students at that time, Tiffany Ignaziak and Kate Ritchie, who's a TF in this class, did fantastic work showing the connection between perfectionism and self-esteem. How people with high independent self-esteem were less likely to be perfectionistic. Why? Because it's about self-expression. It's about constantly learning and growing, and part of learning and growing is falling down and getting up again. No other way to learn. Whereas dependent self-esteem were more concerned, the words of Mike Moldavano that I quoted last time, we say we want the truth. What we mean is that we want to be correct. More dependent on how they're perceived, more perfectionistic, more afraid of failure. So, this applies also, and we've talked about it before, but I just want to point it out again, to relationships. Best work on the topic, David Schnarch again, where he talks about how do we get to the stage of being known rather than being validated. And that doesn't mean that at the age of 70 or 80, when we're fully evolved, we don't enjoy or need at times the validation of our partner. We do. But at the same time, we're much more about self-expression. Here is what David Schnarch has to say. Differentiation is your ability to maintain your sense of self when you're emotionally and or physically close to others, especially as they become increasingly important to you. Differentiation permits you to maintain your own course when lovers, friends, and family pressure you to agree and conform. Well-differentiated people can agree without feeling like they're losing themselves, and can disagree without feeling alienated and embittered. This is what being known is all about. Being yourself, being differentiated. This is what independent self-esteem is. This is what ultimately interdependence is all about. Easier said than done. But again, it's very helpful to have that as a heuristic at the back of your mind, to notice it when it's happening. Because at the age of 20, you're also experiencing moments of interdependence, real connection with a friend, with family, just walking in the yard and admiring the beauty of it all. And these are precious moments that over time we can have more and more of, if we follow the natural path, the natural evolution. Going back to the analogy of walking, I mean, very often when we know these, stories through history, that people were put in, shoes that were too small for them, or were not allowed to try and walk, such as very often the case was in the Romanian under Ceausescu, where people were not allowed to develop naturally. When our natural development is hindered, and it can be hindered, we don't evolve as we can. So the question is, also on the psychological level, how can we evolve as we can? And some of the tools that you learned throughout the semester, whether it was the cognitive tool of learning the permission to be human, or the tools that you can actually apply, such as keeping a journal, such as exercising, such as doing the gratitude exercise, such as meditating or doing yoga. All these things, as you'll see, are ways of becoming more self-actualized, of expediting the process. And when we expedite the process, it means that right now, right here, we're able to experience that sense of being much more often. We don't need to wait till we're 50 or 60 or 70. We can be on that healthy journey way before that. So how do we do it? How do we do it? Let me go back to the model we talked about when we discussed change. And we talked about the ABC of change: affect, behavior, and cognition. And I mentioned that the most important approach to change, the most effective approach to change, is the B, the behavior. And I introduced this model of how attitudes change behavior, and in turn, how behavior changes attitude. Remember self-perception theory. If we want to improve one area in our lives, the best thing to do is to behave as we would. If I want high self-esteem, then I need to behave like a person with high self-esteem behaves. Why? Because self-esteem is simply an attitude. It's the attitude I have toward the self. It's the I evaluating the me. And to enhance that attitude, I need to engage, or the most effective way, not the only way, but the most effective way is to engage in behavior of a person with high self-esteem. Which is why it's so important to have role models. And I'm saying that in the plural. It's important to have role models. People that we can look up to and say, I want to have that character. I want to have the calm and the acceptance and the generosity of spirit that Warren Bennis has. I want to have the passion for teaching that Marva Collins displays. And to create an aggregate of role models so that we can behave and over time achieve that attitude that we're looking for. So let me go over a few of them, of how to enhance self-esteem. We've discussed most, so this is a good summary of some of the things that we went through. First, people with high independent self-esteem generally, as we saw before, from the research, Melissa Christina's research and others, are generally calmer. So independent self-esteem is the attitude, calm is the behavior, which also means that people who behave calmly will increase over time their independent self-esteem. And we see that in related research, on meditation, for example, on mindfulness, that as we induce more of it, our self-esteem, and it's the independent part of self-esteem, because I'm not about accolades, oh, I meditated so well today, everyone clap. It's not about that. It's about inducing calm, being centered, being myself. Or physical exercise. Physical exercise induces calm because it releases certain enzymes, certain chemicals in the body. So that over time actually strengthens our independent self-esteem indirectly, because behavior, experiencing the calm, leads to a change in attitude. Imagine that a spell of anonymity has been cast on you. From now on, and for the rest of your life, no one will know what you're doing. No one but you will know how good you are, how generous you are, how benevolent you are. No one but you will know how wealthy and powerful and important you are. You and you alone will know about all your accomplishments. You and you alone will know about how ethical, moral, and wonderful you are. In such a world where a spell of anonymity has been cast on you, what would you do? Familiar, anyone? What would you do? Now, as I mentioned in the response paper, this does not mean that this is what I need to do with my life, what I would do in this anonymous world. What it is saying, though, is that in such a world, or doing this exercise, it can help us hone in on what we would do regardless of the accolades and praise and prestige. I do this exercise regularly. As you know, no exercise in this class that I assign to you is foreign to me. I do them all. I'm going through this class just as you are. And I do this regularly. And for example, when I did it as a graduate student here, my response was that in such a world, I actually would not get a PhD. I would not get a PhD because it wasn't that pleasurable to me, very meaningful, but less pleasurable to me. I wasn't that good at it. Didn't really feel like I was thriving. But I also said to myself that in our world, not in that world where no one would know what I was doing, but in a world where people know what I'm doing, I would need a PhD in order to teach at a university, which is why I continued and eventually got my PhD. I did this exercise just before I graduated, and I was thinking about different areas to pursue. And I asked myself, what would I do in such a world where no one would know what I was doing? And the answer to that was, I would teach. The answer to that was, I would not do research. That was very clear. And that's when I decided to let go of the tenure track option. Even though there was a lot of pressure on me from the outside, from people who cared about me. And they said, look, 2 or 3 articles and you'll get into a great place on a tenure track. You can do it. You know, your PhD can be published. But I knew that that wasn't the life that I wanted to lead. Is there a price for it? Yes. You know, one of the prizes is that, you know, this is my second last class at Harvard. But what kind of world, what kind of life did I want to ask for myself? And that exercise helped me hone on that. What are your passions? What do you really, really want to do with your life? Where do you see yourself 10 years from now or 20 years from now? What's really important for you? What's important for you that you would do regardless of other people's approval, nods, accolades, or cheering, or disapproval, or criticism? What would you do in such a world? It's an important question to ask. People who have high independent self-esteem, pursue their passions. People who pursue their passions enjoy higher levels of self-esteem. People who enjoy a lot of flow, their independent self-esteem will increase as well. Ask yourself, where do you experience flow? Where do you lose yourself? Is it when you read? Is it over dinner when you're sitting next to your blockmates? Is it when you write? Is it when you stand in front of a class and speak in an after-school program? When do you experience it? When did you experience it in the past? Ask yourself, because that very often is the best predictor of future flow. What kind of life do you want to lead? What do you really, really want to do? People with high independent self-esteem put themselves on the line. They cope. They stretch themselves constantly because they're always about learning and growing, improving, making more of a difference, touching more people. And people who cope, remember self-perception theory, people who cope over time will enjoy higher levels of independent self-esteem. Even if they fall while doing it, even if she says no 4 times, they get up again and they get stronger. And their independent self-esteem strengthens over time. The graph doesn't look just like this, the ups and downs with the spikes. It looks with the same ups and downs, but with an upward trajectory of well-being, happiness, and self-esteem. Humble behavior, genuine humble behavior. And in one of my favorite texts, and I think one of the most important texts in my tradition, Pirkei Avot, the chapters of the fathers, there's a sentence there, a proverb that I've been reading over and over again and never could understand until I heard an interpretation of a well-known rabbi, Rabbi Noach Weinberg, about this interpretation. And here is the sentence. I'm translating. Those who chase after honor, honor will run away from them. Those who run away from honor, honor will chase them. Let me repeat. Those who chase honor, honor will run away from them. Those who run away from honor, honor will chase them. And it didn't make sense to me until I put it in the context as a result of the lecture by Rabbi Weinberg of self-esteem. Honor is essentially honoring the self, believing in oneself. And if I'm constantly about chasing honor, the next accolade, the next prize, the next approval, the next validation, then honor will run away from me. And then I will have to push that stone up a steeper incline the next time. And I continue to chase that honor, and I get there, and then the rock rolls back down again. And Sisyphus continues on and on with the incline becoming steeper. Whereas if I run away from honor, behave humbly, over time, honor, true honor, internally generated honor will chase me. Behavior can change attitude. It takes time. And again, at the beginning, as I mentioned to you before, I wanted to be modest, and I wanted everyone to know how modest I was and how humble I was. And then I understood that, well, that's not genuine, but I can still behave and act in a humble way, and over time, it becomes more and more part of who we are. Behavior, changing attitude. Doesn't happen overnight. And again, that doesn't mean that a person at 80 who's evolved and actualized does not look for honor as well, does not feel good when he or she is praised. That's natural, part of who we are. This is an important one, and we've talked about it a lot in the class, about simplifying. I've often wondered, why is it that in a country like the United States, such an individualistic country, self-reliant, most of you read it in high school by Emerson, so much about individualism and the self, why is it that there are such high levels of conformity? Why is it that so many people go on the path that has already been taken and prescribed by others? That doesn't mean that everyone who goes on that path conforms. Again, you can be highly conforming, choosing to work as a consultant or choosing to be a volunteer at a homeless shelter. You can be equally other-determined or equally self-determined. It's not about choosing the particular path. But why do we see so many people who conform? And I think it's because of the rat race. I think it's because people in the United States, Western world in general, do not take enough time to reflect and to think about those questions such as, what do I really, really want to do with my life? To ask questions such as, what would I do in a world where no one would know what I was doing? To go through the three-question process, the meaning, what is meaningful, what is pleasurable, what do I enjoy, and what am I good at, what are my strengths? To go through these questions and to ask those important questions, because when we take a step back and take the time, that's when we become ourselves. That's when we identify the path that is right for me. Let me illustrate this by showing you a stage model, and this is based on the work of Daniel Gilbert. Indirectly refers to it, his work on cognitive busyness. And what he and others have shown is that people behave very differently when they're cognitively busy, when they're in a hurry, versus when they have time. They can focus on whatever it is that they're doing. So also connected to Tim Cass's work on time affluence. So the first stage is the stage where we don't have time, where we're in a hurry, we're rushed, our reaction is automatic. This is the part where we conform. This is when we conform to the group, as in the Ash experiments. This is when we conform to the man with the white coat telling us the experiment must go on, and we push the button and shock an innocent victim. This is where conformity to obedience, conformity to the group is, when we don't have time, when we're busy, when we don't really think about what it is that we want to do or can do. This is our dependent self, stage 1. We very often, at this moment, can reach stage 2. Don't need to wait for a long time. At this moment, if we take the time. Because when we take the time, that's when we engage in deliberate reflection, combining reflection and action. Where we think about what we do, we think about what we think. We take our time. This is where the self is autonomous. This is where the independent self-esteem emerges. When we have the time. That's when we're much less likely to conform. That's when we're cultivating and expressing our independent core self. Think of the following experiment. And this cannot be done today, well, I don't know if it's unfortunate, but it cannot be done today. And that is to retry the Milgram experiment with one difference. Imagine this. So most of you know the Milgram experiment. We've spoken about it here. You're sitting on the chair with your hand on the buttons, or in front of you, you have the panel, and you go up to 60 volts. And there's no real reaction from the other person, the learner, and then you go up to 75 volts in 15-volt increments. And then you get to 120 volts. And the confederate, whom you think is really being shocked, says, "Ouch, that hurts." And you go and you look up at the person with the white coat, and he says to you, "The experiment must go on." And you go up, and the person is screaming and telling you he has a heart condition. And you look up at the experimenter, who looks like this, and he tells you, "I never noticed him until now. I'm glad I never noticed him." He says to you, "The experiment must go on." And you go on, and then they start to whimper and say, "I have a heart condition, get me out of here." And you look up, and the experimenter says, "No answer is wrong answer. Raise the voltage, the experiment must go on." Now, 63% of participants went above 350 volts, which is beyond the level where the person was not even heard anymore. They continue to shock them until the point of XXX, beyond very dangerous. Because he told them that the experiment must go on. Now imagine the same experiment with a slight difference. You give them 75 volts and they say, "Ouch, that hurts." And then the experiment tells you, "The experiment must go on. Why don't you come back in 15 minutes? And you go out for 15 minutes. And you come back again. And it's now at 90. And you go up, let's say, you go up to 120. At 120, the person is screaming, "Get me out of here. You have no right to keep me here." And you look up at the experiment, and the experiment says, "The experiment must go on. But why don't you take a 15-minute break?" What do you think would happen if people were given 15-minute breaks between shocks? Do you think 63% would go to extremely dangerous and beyond? Probably not. Because during these 15 minutes, when they're no longer in a hot state, but rather in a cold state, the words of George Lowenstein, when they're in a cold state, they will think, "Am I out of my mind? What am I doing here?" And they would go and call the police, as opposed to go back 15 minutes later, "Okay, now I'm willing to kill them," which is essentially what they presumably did in that experiment. But when they didn't have those 15 minutes, when it was, "The experiment must go on, the experiment must go on," it went on, and they paid a price of losing themselves. And this is what happens to us in modern life. No, not with such dire consequences as potentially could have been with Milgram, and we're not doing immoral things, as the case is with obedience to authority. But we're hurting ourselves very often because we're running around and we're conforming. And we're doing what they think we should do. We're doing what that voice or voices are telling us to do. We're not doing what we are meant to be doing. You know what I think the most important part of this class? It's sections and response papers. This is not out of modesty. Yes, I want you to think I'm modest, but that's not why I'm saying it. It's because that is when you get the time to reflect, to talk about it with your teaching fellows, with your fellow students, to think about it. You're quote-unquote forced to take a time out. It's when you sit down and write those response papers about these questions that I mentioned. That's when your real autonomous, shining self comes out. It's when you talk to your friends about this class or your blockmates in the dining hall. When you take the time to share it with your parents. That's when it is happening. Finally, integrity. Nathaniel Branden did this with many of his clients. He's a therapist, where he would bring them in and tell them, okay, for the next week, stop, no lies, be fully integrated, be fully honest. And what he found was when he applied it, especially to people who would lie a little bit more, that enhanced their self-esteem. I remember back in 1990, I think it was 96 or 97, when the whole Clinton impeachment trial was going on CNN, they brought on DePaulo. She's a professor at the University of Virginia. And she does research on lying. And they interviewed her, and it was the first time I was exposed to her work. And she said on CNN that her research shows that basically everyone lies. Many times little lies intended to impress others, many times bigger lies. And what she found was that people are on average about 3 times a day. And when I heard it, I scoffed. I said, well, maybe other people lie 3 times a day. I don't lie. And let me explain to you why I don't lie. And this is true. Because I wrote my senior thesis in college on the concept of honesty pays. I was a joint philosophy and psychology concentrator, was interested in ethics, self-esteem, motivation. And what I showed, based on research, based on philosophical works by Aristotle, by Adam Smith, that we pay a high psychological and emotional price whenever we lie, whenever we cheat, when we're dishonest. And then I said to myself, but let me try DePaulo's exercise. What she does is have people evaluate their conversations for honest or dishonest content right after it finishes. So when it's still fresh in their mind what they talked about. So they keep a journal which is completely anonymous. So I said, but I'm going to do it, even though I don't lie, because I know the consequences of lying, because I wrote my thesis on it. I'm an expert on honesty. I said I'll still do it, because I like to try experiments. As it happens, I went on a date that night. Someone whom I'd never met before. It was not Rena. Someone whom my mom set me up with. My mom and her mom taught together in the same school. And I heard wonderful things about her. I was very excited. I became even more excited when we met. And we were sitting down having a lovely dinner and talking, and she's an economist, very successful economist, and she asked me what I was doing, and I told her that I was a psychologist, and I was really impressing her with all my knowledge of psychology. And then she said, I'm also interested in psychology. And I said, this is going really well, to myself, not to her. I learned not to say those things on earlier dates. So we were sitting down and learn to fail. So we were sitting down and talking, and then she said, oh, I just read about the psychologist, and she said the name, and this very famous psychologist, you know him, right? Now, I didn't have the faintest clue who she was talking about. No idea. And I remember pausing for a second and looking at her and just smiling. And the conversation continued to flow. Now, I would not have noticed this, except for the fact that afterwards I went home and went over the conversation. Sonny said, hey, wait a minute. I just lied to her. And ever since then, I've been doing this regularly. Lying, that is. I've been doing this regularly. Ever since then, I've been doing the integrity exercise that De Paulo talks about, that Nathaniel Branden talks about, to be very conscious of my conversations. Am I just saying things to impress which are not authentic? Am I having those little lies? Because you see, when we are telling the truth, the message we communicate to ourselves, the message that we communicate to ourselves is that my words are worthy, my words are important, I matter. And when we don't do that, when we tell lies, or when we're about impressing constantly, we're saying, I'm not good enough as I am. I need to be someone else so that the other person likes. I need to know that psychologist, because otherwise she won't like me. Instead of being authentic and real. Instead of being known rather than validated. And doing it and being conscious of it for a week at a time, until the behavior changes our attitude. And I begin to value my words much more. When I communicate myself, who I am, rather than try and impress others. When I assert myself, when I say no at times, so that I can simplify my life a little bit. When I say yes when it's appropriate, even if it's not the most popular yes in the world, but it's right for me. And it's about expanding it, in time as well as in space. It is starting, first of all, by myself. Why does journaling help so much? Why does therapy with an empathic therapist, why does it work so well? Because we're ourselves. We don't try and impress the therapist. After a while, we open up. We don't try and impress our journal. We are ourselves. And expanding it from our journal, which makes us feel good, to close relationships to others. From doing it one day, one conversation at a time, to a week of integrity treatment, so to speak, to lifelong. Imagine leading this life. How freed up do we feel when you no longer need to express or impress ourselves constantly, where we can just be known, where we can just be ourselves. How much lighter, how much more power, how much more integrity and authenticity will we experience, how much happier will we be. I want to end by reading you an excerpt from Melissa Christino's journal, which she cited in her senior thesis. This, of course, is with her permission. Melissa Christino was an undergraduate here, class of 2002. And this is what she writes. Your true potential lies way, way down in the depths of your soul. In the pit of your stomach, past your knowledge, beyond your nervousness, and buried under your fears and anxieties. As hidden as it may be, it is still there. I know it's there because I've felt it before, and I know it's there in others too, because I've seen others perform miracles. There is a faint glow of unparalleled potential in all of us, and when we find it, it shines. It's there in each and every one of us, this glow. And if we feed it, if we cultivate it, it grows. And it grows to the level that it expands beyond the self, where people like Warren Bennis, where people like Nelson Mandela, where people like Anita Roddick, people like Mother Teresa, just their presence, their being shines a light onto others. So what I'd like you to do now, we have 4 more minutes. Here is what I'd like to do now. I'm going to play a song for you. Usually played at the beginning. I want to play it at the end today. If you feel comfortable, you can close your eyes and listen to the words of the song and what they mean to you, what they mean in the context of your life. So if you feel comfortable, close your eyes and listen, really listen to the following words.
I am what I am my own special creation. So come take a look, give me the hook or the ovation. It's my world that I want to have a little pride in. My world, and it's not a place I have to hide in. Life's not worth a damn till you can
We're gonna do it.
I am what I am.
Open your eyes. Come on. Get up. I am what I am and what... All right, let's go down. Let's join them.